Right, we're almost there. Okay, we are live now, so everything's working. Great, so welcome everybody to the third day of our conference on truth and contradiction in Christian Neoplatonism. So I'm happy to introduce our third keynote speaker of the conference, Professor Elizabeth Brient. And her talk today is entitled All Likenesses Must Break, Exploding Metaphors, Exploding Texts in Meister, Eckhart, and Nicholas of Cusa. And just a few words about Elizabeth Brient before we get started. She's my own teacher, so I'm very excited to have been able to invite her today and to hear her talk. She's also the main reason why I even read Meister Eckhart and started writing on him and doing the comparative work between Zen and Eckhart. So Elizabeth also taught me Heidegger. So I took a seminar on Heidegger, so I can also put that responsibility at your feet as well.
Oh, no.
I'm very happy about, actually. So she's an associate professor at the University of Georgia. She has interest in continental philosophy, medieval philosophy, medieval mysticism, Neoplatonism. She's also interested in and has written on the epochal transition from the medieval to the early modern age. And she's also interested in Blumenberg and Hannah Arendt in this connection, especially with the concept of natality in Hannah Arendt. Her book, The Immanence of the Infinite, Hans Blumenberg and the Threshold to Modernity, is an important book on the subject of epochal transition and was also helpful for me in my own reading and writing. So without further ado, Elizabeth, please take it away.
Okay. Thanks very much, Greg, for that lovely introduction. And it's just such a pleasure to be at this conference and be invited by you and have kind of circles continue. And Dermot, who gave the first keynote talk, was my teacher. And so we've got, it's a lovely thing. And I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Of course.
Okay, so let me just start off by saying that has been a long time a philosophical commonplace to say that human reason is governed by the law of non-contradiction. But as we know, Meister Eckhart and Nicholas of Cusa, for them, this applies to the limited form of human knowing that's characteristic of, I don't know, what do we want to call it? Distinguishing reason directed towards the multiplicity and distinctness of created things, of discrete concepts, of finite images. So, for example, oranges are not lemons. They are fruit, but they are not vegetables. And they are certainly not cats, although they are organic. A triangle has three sides. It's not a square, although it is a polygon. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious. Love is not proud. Rational concepts pick out and name their objects by at the same time distinguishing them from what they are not. Right? The law of non-contradiction at work, generating a great endless web of comparative relations between things, articulating what any given thing is and what it's not. Right? For both Eckhart and Cusanus, this sort of reasoning, guided by the principle of non-contradiction, is an inevitably limited and, for both of them, ultimately inadequate form of human intellection, which seeks to know things in terms of their interrelated distinctions. Right? While this form of human knowing, which distinguishes what something is from what it is not, is a method which can at least help us to grasp the comparative interrelations between particular things, it can never lead to knowledge of God. It is not simply inadequate to the task, it is incompatible with the task. Why? This is because God, as infinite unity, does not stand in any comparative relation to anything else. Right? As we've heard over and over the last couple of days, God is not this or that, the way something might be an orange or an isosceles triangle or an act of love. God is not a distinct being. Neither is God not this and not that, the way an orange is not a vegetable and not a cat. Right? God is indistinct from all beings as the absolute ground of their being. So God is utterly distinct from all finite beings, which themselves are distinct from each other. He's distinct from them precisely because God is absolutely one or indistinct from anything. So this is the way Eckhart formulates it in his commentary on wisdom. Everything which is distinguished by indistinction is the more Everything which is distinguished by indistinction is the more distinct, the more indistinct it is, because it is distinguished by its own indistinction. Conversely, it is the more indistinct, the more distinct it is, because it is indistinguished by its own distinction from what is indistinct. Okay. Or as Cusa explains, this is in De Doctor Ignorantia, oppositions. Oppositions apply only to those things that admit a greater and a lesser, and they apply in different ways, but never to the absolutely maximum, God. For it is the absolutely maximum, God, is above all opposition. Therefore, because the absolutely maximum is absolutely and actually all that can be, and is without opposition to such an extent that the minimum coincides with the maximum, it is above all affirmation and all negation. It both is and is not all that is conceived to be. It both is and is not all that is conceived not to be. But it is a this in such a way that it is all things, and it is all things in such a way that it is none of them. Absolute maximness could not be actually all possible things unless it were infinite and the limit of all things and unable to be limited by any of them. Okay. So over the course of the last couple of days, we've heard a lot of this sort of dialectical language. We talked about sort of like the type of mysticism that Eckhart is engaged in as a form of dialectical mysticism. You could say the same for Cusa. They both use this kind of dialectical language that's characteristic, as we know of Neoplatonic thinkers, from Plotinus to Proclus, Pseudo-Dionysius, Eriugena, right? From the viewpoint of ordinary Aristotelian logic, such dialectical predication does not resolve the contradictions present in the various forms of speaking about God. On the contrary, it intensifies them, it complicates them until they explode the limits of language and this kind of distinguishing thought. This way of speaking, these kind of dialectical formulations, it's like sticking a monkey wrench into the smooth workings of distinguishing reason, introducing a kind of virus into the system, which explodes patterns of thought, which are governed by the law of non-contradiction. But the explosion isn't merely destructive, right? The way in which it explodes ordinary knowing is meant to open us up to a new field of awareness, transforming knowing into a dynamic and receptive unknowing of divine unity. So Cusa says, for example, the absolutely maximum transcends all our understanding, which is unable by the path of reason to combine contradictories in their source. And reason, falling far short of this infinite power, cannot join together contradictories, which are infinitely distant. Okay, so he's reflecting on, this reason's shipwreck, right, in its attempt to combine contradictories in their source. And then he immediately goes on, very next sentence, to conclude something from this experience, right, Greg? Therefore, we see incomprehensibly above every reasoning that the absolute maximness to which nothing is opposed and with which the minimum coincides is infinite. Right? So it's the experience of the way in which the infinite overruns finite determinations in this act of trying to combine contradictories that makes possible the receptive awareness of the divine infinite, or the infinite one, divine one. Right? These kinds of formulations explode upon themselves and propel us into a kind of unknowing of infinite unity. The unknowing of divine infinity in Eckhart makes possible in his language an awareness or a hearing of the divine infinite word, the word that's full with all things. And it prepares the ground for breaking through, which, to use McGinn's felicitous phrase, explodes both the text and the self into the divine indistinction. Right? Breakthrough, which explodes both the text and the self into the divine indistinction. The unknowing of divine infinity in Cusanus makes possible the incomprehensible seeing of the coincidence of contradictories. And so learned ignorance opens the gate that allows us to pass beyond this coincidence to the place where God is found unveiled. Right? Yesterday, this metaphor in De Visione Dei of the wall of coincidence of contradictories came up. And so I wanted to read the passage where Cusanus describes it here. It's really important here. So he says, I thank you, my God, because you make clear to me that there's no other way of approaching you except that which to all humans, even to the most learned philosophers, seems wholly inaccessible and impossible. For you have shown me that you cannot be seen elsewhere than where impossibility confronts and obstructs me. Okay, you have shown me that you cannot be seen elsewhere than precisely there, right, where impossibility confronts and obstructs me. O Lord, you who are the food of the mature, give me the courage to do violence to myself, for impossibility coincides with necessity. And I have discovered that the place where you are found unveiled is girded about with the coincidence of contradictories. This is the wall of paradise. And it is here in paradise that you reside. The wall's gate, this wall of contradictories, right? The wall's gate, he says, is guarded by the highest spirit of reason. And unless that highest spirit of reason is overpowered, the way will not lie open. Thus, it is on the other side of the coincidence of contradictories that you will be able to be seen and nowhere on this side. Okay, so in this paper, I want to explore the dynamics of exploding texts, exploding images, exploding metaphors in Eckhart and Cusanus, who are using them as a means for eliciting this like transformed awareness, this unknowing that's able to incomprehensibly comprehend the coincidence of opposites in infinite unity, right? And so unlock the gate, as it were. Okay. All right, so it was Hans Blumenberg who in 1960 in his Paradigms for a Metaphorology, so it's an early book on metaphor, first coined the term explosive metaphorics, Sprengmetaphorik, to describe Cusanus's use of exploding mathematical metaphors to evoke the coincidence of opposites in God. I can give lots of examples in discussion if you want, but I don't have time to go into all of them here. There's the circle with the inscribed polygon, right? That figures both truth, the truth of the essence of things, and the human attempt to know it, right? So truth is the circle, the polygon inscribed in the circle is our attempt to know the truth, right? And no matter how many sides the polygon has, it's always going to be infinitely distant from the circle. You can go keep adding one more side to the polygon, and even though it approaches the circle, it's never going to coincide with it. Although we see at the limit, there's a coincidence of polygon and circle. And he uses it again in De Doctor Ignorantia to figure the relationship between God and a human being. And Christ turns out to be the infinitely sided polygon that coincides with the circle. So Christ is the limit of human nature as it approaches the divine, the perfection of human nature, human intellect. So, I'll throw that out there because I think that we might want to talk about that. That's also an exploding metaphor that's a really important one for Cusanus. But Blumenberg takes as exemplary, and I think he's right here, of an exploding metaphor, the infinite sphere metaphor for God, which Cusanus would have found in numerous sources, including Eckhart, but originally in the Book of 24 Philosophers. It's proposition number 2 there, and it reads as follows: God is an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. Let's just sit for a moment with this metaphor. I want to say, and this is really important, it isn't simply a proposition conveying some true piece of knowledge, some kind of true information about the nature of God. Okay. I want to say that the metaphor is actually a spiritual exercise. You have to perform the metaphor by attempting to think it, by trying to envision it with the mind's eye. Okay, so let's just take a moment here and try to conjure an infinite sphere. Okay, so first of all, a finite sphere, right? It's a figure, a three-dimensional figure whose surface is composed of all the points that are equidistant from some discrete fixed center. Okay, now let's try to imagine, to conjure in our mind's eye, an infinite sphere. Okay. All right, an infinite sphere, it can't have a fixed center and a bounding circumference. If it did, it would be a finite sphere of a particular magnitude, right? After all, right, a sphere is just defined as the surface formed by the collection of all points equidistant from that fixed center. All right, so if we try and imagine a finite sphere, that becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, right, until it vanishes into nothingness, right, when we give up on the idea of the periphery altogether, right? We can try that, but when we try thinking about it that way, just sort of like taking a finite sphere and just blowing it up, until it disappears altogether, we realize that we don't really have a thought of an infinite sphere at all, right? As long as we're imagining a circumference, no matter how large, we're still thinking of a finite sphere, right? And we imagine the circumference getting larger and larger, and then finally vanishing altogether, right? But we don't end up with an experience of an infinite sphere, right? Just a whole lot of nothing, right? So how do we conjure an infinite sphere, right? We need to take the pseudo-Hermetic formula as instructions for something to be performed. Okay, the infinite sphere, we are told, has its center everywhere and its circumference nowhere. So we start by trying to imagine a sphere whose center is everywhere. Imagination, indeed intellect, right, can only do this in a way discreetly, right? When I try and picture a center being everywhere, we do this sequentially. We kind of like try to picture the infinite sphere, center is at this point in space, over here, over here, over here, right? Everywhere, right? But I'm not being asked to imagine a plethora of points in space or the collection of all points in space. I'm asked to identify every possible point as a center and as the center of a sphere. Right? And at the same time, each point is a center, not just of a sphere, but of an infinite sphere. So as I try and think of each point everywhere as a center, I have to include in my thought of the center the circumference, right, to which each center is related. So now maybe I've got the whole, I might try like thinking, okay, well, at this point, there's a whole infinite series of circumferences that could surround this particular, sphere, right? So then you could think about like this infinite series of spheres that increase in magnitude, ad infinitum, right? And here the same thing. So we've got like, sphere, 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 right? The imagination overrun with the thought of countless centers and spheres, right? Merging and commingling, right? Into an indefinite beyond, right? Wheels within wheels, as Cusanus put it, or like multiple expanding rings of water on an infinite lake, right? That's an image from Eckhart. The rings proliferate into an unimaginable plenitude at the limits of thought itself. The attempt to imagine the infinite sphere proliferates and overruns itself completely until at the very limits of thought, beyond any possible beyond, it explodes into an experience of unimaginable plenitude, of the coincidence of center and circumference, of the simultaneity of divine transcendence and immanence, right? The figure of the infinite sphere evokes the experience really of a kind of double infinity, both intensive and extensive. God's center is located at every point, indicating the absolute plenitude and infinite richness of God's being, where there's no limit, no boundary at all to the extent of God's all-encompassing reach. Right? The infinite sphere figures the divine nature as an intensive plenitude, without end, without bounds. The third proposition of the Book of 24 Philosophers goes on to strengthen this sense of the intensive infinity of God by asserting that God in his entirety is present in every part, right? God in his entirety is present in every part. And then proposition 18 in the Book of 24 Philosophers describes God as a sphere which has just as many circumferences as points. Once again, an exploding image which can make sense only in the case of an infinite sphere. These three propositions, if you take them together, they provide a wonderful springboard for thinking the coincidence of transcendence and immanence, a way of conjuring, I don't even want to say conceptualizing, conjuring infinite unity, which cannot be grasped with finite concepts or through distinguishing reason, discursive reason. The metaphor of the infinite sphere finds its meaning precisely in the way in which the infinite overruns the limitations inherent in its attempted visualization and discrete conceptualization. You might think here, that the experience of the infinite sphere is an experience of what Kant calls the mathematical sublime, right? The imagination is completely overrun. I have to think about that some more, but anyway, let me give just one of the many examples where Eckhart uses the infinite sphere metaphor for God. And of course, Cusanus used it very famously in On Learned Ignorance as a figure both for God, and then he transfers it to the world, right? And so we get sort of like Cusa as a precursor to modern cosmology. But in Eckhart, here's a great example from Eckhart in his commentary on Exodus, where Eckhart actually references all three propositions from that Book of 24 Philosophers, which is, by the way, just kind of like a condensation of kind of theses from Proclus. So it's kind of Proclean philosophy. Okay, so here's Eckhart. With his whole being, God is present, whole and entire, as much in the least thing as in the greatest. Thus, the just person who loves God in all things would seek in vain for something more or greater when he has some little thing in which the God whom he loves alone to the exclusion of everything else is totally present. There is no greater or less in God, nor in the one. They are below and outside God and the one, the greater or the less. And thus someone who sees, seeks, and loves what is more or less is not as such divine. Notice he doesn't say someone who sees, seeks, and loves what is more or less is not going to find the divine. He says, someone who sees, seeks, and loves what is more or less is not as such divine. This is the meaning of the axiom in the Book of 24 Philosophers. God is the infinite intellectual sphere with as many circumferences as centers, and whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. He is entire in his least part. That's the Eckhart quote. As Eric Pearl had emphasized very rightly yesterday, divine transcendence necessarily implies divine immanence, right? Here, Eckhart stresses the simultaneity of divine transcendence and immanence. The one as infinite transcends all relative relations of more or less, greater or smaller, which are applicable only to things of finite determination. All relative relations are below and outside the divine one, which knows no such distinction. At the same time, God is present, whole and entire, in each and every entity as the principle and ground of their being. Apart from God, they are nothing at all. This dynamic is expressed beautifully in German sermon 13a. Eckhart says, God touches all things and remains untouched. God is above all things and in standing in himself. And this standing in himself sustains all creatures. He is the ground and the encirclement of all creatures, unquote. Okay, so to recapitulate, exploding metaphors of this type are used to shatter finite modes of thinking and conjure an experience of the coincidence of opposites in infinite unity. Blumenberg points out in his treatment of these explosive metaphors that the blasting agent in this explosive metaphorics is the concept of infinity. And I want to say it's the carefully controlled use of this blasting agent in the construction of explosive metaphors that really distinguish them from more straightforward analogical, or what I call mapping metaphors. So to understand what's different about the dynamics of exploding metaphors, it's going to be helpful to look, first of all, by way of contrast, at the way in which just stable, non-explosive metaphors operate to aid our understanding of something unfamiliar. Okay. Take circles and spheres, and I'm just talking about regular finite circles and spheres here. They've been used for a long time, for ages and ages, to express the relationship between eternity and time, being and becoming, creator and creation, mind and thought. Right? The relationship between these dual pairs is elucidated by analogy with the relationship between the center of a circumference, the center of a circle, and the circumference that surrounds it, where we understand the circumference as an unfolding of the power of the center. So, for example, we might say that the relationship between eternity and time is like the relationship between the center and circumference of a circle, right? The now of eternity is like the center of a circle, and time is like the circumference drawn around the circle as a multiplicity that is sequentially unfolded from the potent unity of the center, eternity. Okay. This sort of metaphor enlightens understanding by evoking an old familiarity that we already have with circles and how we draw circles and our experience with circles. So we evoke this old familiarity with circles to engender a new understanding of the relationship of time to eternity, right? And we do this by carrying over, literally metaphore, carrying over the mathematical relationship between center and circumference, and applying this familiar structure by analogy to the relationship between eternity and time. We say this relationship is like that relationship. A is to B, so C is to D, right? Now, the figure of an infinite sphere as a metaphor for God operates in an altogether different way. It does not aid understanding by setting up a ratio between two similar structures. There's no A is to B, so C is to D. As it's not, it's like this relationship is like that relationship. There is no ratio or similarity, no proportional relationship that's transferred in this way. In the thought of an infinite sphere, the structural relationship that holds between the center and circumference of a finite sphere, the one that defines it as a finite sphere, right? The structural relationship is not carried over to the infinite sphere. It's blown up, right? This relationship is radically transformed in the shattering of the finite figure. The introduction of the infinite into the metaphorical content of the figure serves to explode the structure of the finite figure itself, and the very structure which had defined and delineated the corresponding finite figure. And as I've said, it's the experience of the way in which this structure explodes that proves to be illuminating. So not the carryover of a relationship, but the experience of the explosion and how it's happening and what's transformed in the relationship, right? So that something transformative is happening. Mapping metaphors depend on likenesses and structure between the metaphor and the thing to which it's compared. But exploding metaphors aren't likenesses at all. They work by way of experiential transformation. Okay. Understanding isn't evoked by way of translation and comparison, but rather it's our understanding itself that's transformed. And it's transformed in the very process of the transformation of the metaphoric content. So this is happening simultaneously. Nicholas of Cusa describes a method for constructing such exploding mathematical metaphors in chapter 12 of the first book of De Doctor Ignorantia. This is a method that can be used, he says, to help us apprehend different divine truths. Cusanus begins by pointing out that the simply maximum, God, quote, cannot be any of the things which we know or of which we have any concept, unquote. Such things and their concepts are determinate and determining, delimited and delimiting. They are what they are by virtue of standing in a determinate relationship to everything that they are and everything that they're not. But the simply maximum as such cannot stand in comparative relation to any of them. There is no proportion between the finite and the infinite, as Cusanus never tires of reminding us. Our only avenue, therefore, Cusanus concludes, is to attempt to approach divine things through symbols, but not symbols insofar as they are likenesses and operate by way of comparison, but insofar as they explode finite likenesses and propel intuition beyond likenesses. Okay, so here's the passage in which he gives his method. He says, when therefore we propose to investigate this maximum, God, by means of symbols, we must leap beyond all likenesses. He says, we must leap beyond simple likenesses. For all mathematicals are finite, otherwise they could not even be imagined. Therefore, if we want to use finite things as a method for ascending to this simply maximum, we have to do three things. First, we must consider finite mathematical figures along with their attributes and their relationships. Okay, finite figures, attributes, relations. Then we must transfer these relations to corresponding infinite figures. And then finally, at a still higher level, we have to apply the relations of the infinite figures to the infinite simple, which is entirely independent of every figure altogether, right? And then he says, as we labor in the dark of enigma, our ignorance will be taught incomprehensibly how we are to think of the Most High more correctly and more truly. Okay, I want to underscore here that Cusanus is offering us a method here, a method that has three basic moves. First, considering the finite mathematical figure with its relationships and attributes, so like a finite circle and the relationship between center, circumference, diameter, radius, etc. Second, we transfer these relations to the corresponding infinite figures. And when we do that, we see there's a crucial sense in which actually the functions of the attributes and relations remain, but they're so radically transformed in such a way that we're able to experience the unity of what was held as necessarily distinct in the finite figure, right? So in the performance of the transformation of the finite figure, these distinctions are shattered along with the delimited and delimiting kind of distinguishing reasoning that's guided by the law of non-contradiction. Let me give an example. Going back to the infinite circle. In an infinite circle, center, circumference, and diameter coincide, but their unity has absorbed the function of center, circumference, and diameter in a meaningful way. As circumference, the infinite circle is most one and most capacious and all-encompassing, right? The diameter is all-penetrating, and the center is one and most indivisible. Right? That's going to, so we get this kind of unity of function that still remains, right, in the infinite figure. And then the third move, finally, we apply at a still higher level the relations of the infinite figure to the infinite simple, right, God, which is entirely independent of every figure. So, for example, when he's talking about the infinite circle, and Cusanus makes this move from finite circle to infinite circle, and then from infinite circle to just the infinite as such, he says, and when he's talking about the infinite as such, he's calling it here in this passage the maximum. He says, you see that the whole maximum is most perfectly within all things as simple and indivisible, because it is infinite center, that while it is outside every being, it encompasses all things because it is the infinite circumference, and that it penetrates all things because it is the infinite diameter. And then he goes on, it is the beginning of all because it's the center, it's the end of all because it's the circumference, and it's the middle of all because it's the diameter. And he goes on and gives a whole long list in this way. And then at the end of his list, he says, and I could go on. Anyway, what I want to emphasize here is that when you go from the finite figure to the infinite as such, when you go from the infinite figure to the infinite as such, from the infinite sphere or circle to God, right? What is transferred in the explosive metaphor is both the experience of the coincidence of opposites and the transformed knowing which experiences this. That is, we have here both the radical transformation of the attributes and relations that are characteristic of any finite figure, and also a letting go of the process of understanding that's characteristic of discursive thought, distinguishing reason, right, governed by the law of non-contradiction. The transformed knowing is an unknowing that is at the same time an experiential awareness, an incomprehensible seeing of the coincidence of opposites that's gained in the explosion of the finite figure. Now, another thing I think is really important about Blumenberg's reflections on Sprengmetaphorik, this exploding metaphorics, is that exploding metaphors are not only performative and experiential, right, but that the truth that is revealed by them and in them is essentially pragmatic. Right? The truth that's revealed by and in explosive metaphors is essentially pragmatic. What do I mean? What does he mean? The dynamic experience of the metaphor's explosion induces an attitude, a Verhaltung, he says, a stance or a way of being. I want to say a radically altered state of consciousness or a radically altered standing in consciousness. A transformation that Eckhart calls transformed knowing or unknowing, Unwissen, and Cusanus calls learned ignorance or incomprehensible seeing. Anyway, okay, so in this paper, I want to suggest that we can see the same general method of constructing explosive metaphors at work, not only in mathematical metaphors, but in the kind of paradoxical figures and textual interpretations that Eckhart and Cusanus use to propel us beyond the limitations of distinguishing reason into the divine. So the rest of my paper just looks at a series of examples of such exploding metaphors that aren't mathematicals, but are symbols or figures or interpretations. So I don't have time to talk about all of them. I'll tell you what I have on my list. I've got also, and I'd be interested to know if you have suggestions for other things I could add to my list here. I've got the all-seeing or infinite gaze of the icon on the vision of God. Eckhart's sermon on the Martha and Mary story, his sermon on the Virgin Wife. Eckhart and Cusanus both talk about the where, God as the where of all things. Where, like where is God? Like God is where. The symbol of the perfect mirror. The Eckhart's way of talking about hearing the unspoken word. Anyway, I've got more on my list, but those are the ones I was working on in the context of this paper. Probably will have time only to talk about one or two of them. I'm going to start with the all-seeing icon, and maybe we'll get to the Martha and Mary story. And I'm happy to talk about other examples during discussion if anyone's particularly interested. Okay, Cusanus wrote on the vision of God at the request of the monks of the Benedictine Abbey at Tegernsee, where he used to kind of go in for retreats in the midst of his very, very stressful, hectic, active life. Along with the text, he sent a painting. It was a portrait of an omnivoyant and all-seeing face, probably Christ's, which Cusanus refers to as an icon of God. And the text in the painting, he says, were to be used by the monks as what he calls a devotional exercise, intending to uplift them to mystical theology. Okay. Unfortunately, the painting's been lost, so we don't know exactly what the image looked like, but we do know that the painting was done. It's one of those paintings where no matter where you stand in the room, when you look at the painting, the eyes look like they're looking at you, and when you walk, and you kind of like watch the eyes and you walk across the room, the eyes seem to be following you. I remember vividly the first time I experienced that as a kid when I went to a museum, and I was just like, what? Right? Okay, so you can imagine these monks probably who haven't had this experience before either. They get sent this icon. And Cusanus says, okay, hang the painting on the wall and have all of the brother monks stand around it, look at the icon, look at the face, right? Look at his eyes. And he says, and I quote, "And each of you will experience that from whatever place one observes it, the face will seem to regard him alone. To a brother standing in the east, the face will look eastward. To one in the south, it will look southward. To one in the west, westward. First, you will marvel at how the face looks on all, and each one of you at the same time." Okay, now notice this emphasis. The face looks on all of the monks and at each one, right? At the same time. The marvel here, right, is not simply that the face looks on all of the individual monks at the same time, taking them all in at once, simultaneously seeing them all, right? The idea of the capacity of an all-seeing gaze, though already incredible, is still perhaps somehow imaginable. Like, if, your view were big enough, the angle of your vision wide enough, like, if you had, what is it, like Mad Eye Moody and Harry Potter's, like that eye that can see in the back and like all around, up, down, simultaneously, right? Then you could like take it all in at once, right? What Cusanus emphasizes here is not just that, this icon can see all the monks at once. What's so marvelous is, right, that it can also simultaneously see them all at once and at the same time look directly at each monk individually, right, directly focusing on specifically each one, right? Each monk experiences the gaze as focused on him alone, right? It's not simply that he experiences the icon looking at him, by the way. Remember, he's looking at the icon, right? So what we've got here is, mutual gaze. You're looking into the eyes of the icon. He and the painted face, are gazing to each other's eyes, right? So the experience is one of these experiences of mutual gazing into the eyes of another, right? This is an intimate and exclusive act, right? And yet this experience is shared by all of the monks simultaneously. That's beautiful, right? So what we have here with this all-seeing gaze, this infinite gaze, is another exploding metaphor, right? It presupposes our experience of the finite figure, the finite gaze, the mutual gaze between two people, right? When two people look into each other's eyes, the mutual gaze, it's exclusive, it's profoundly intimate, right? When two lovers gaze into each other's eyes, or when a mother and child gaze into each other's eyes, right? They have no eyes for anyone else. The rest of the world vanishes. Only the eyes and soul, right, of the other is fully present. Each holds the other in exclusive and intimate mutuality, right? And the intimacy is tied to the exclusivity. It's a powerful experience precisely because it's the exclusion of everything else and everyone else. On the other hand, when I look out at a crowd, like say when I'm giving a lecture, not on Zoom, right? But like in my intro class, I'm looking out at all my students, right? I have a kind of dilated gaze that takes them all in as a whole. So I see in a way all of my students, right? But that gaze is in no way intimate, right? It's inclusive. It embraces them all, right? But it's not intimate. I'm not directly looking at any one of them. But with the infinite figure, the all-seeing infinite gaze, right? Each brother monk feels as though the divine has eyes only for him. As he walks across the room, his eyes remain fixed on the eyes of Christ, which follow him unwaveringly. The gaze is experienced as intimate, exclusive, and unbroken. And yet, each of the brothers is having the same intimate experience of exclusive, mutual, unbroken connection. They share this with each other. They discover that the exclusive gaze turns out to be an all-inclusive gaze, and its inclusivity does not prohibit its intimate exclusivity. Mind-blowing, right? So this experience of the all-seeing icon or infinite gaze is actually strikingly similar to the experience that we have in thinking or performing or conjuring the infinite sphere. Metaphor for God, right? So with the all-seeing gaze, there's no outer limit to the sweep of the divine vision. It takes in all monks, all creatures, everything that is, right? Just as the infinite sphere has its circumference nowhere, the circumference is all embracing, right? There is nothing that's not embraced by the circumference, right? And just as the gaze of the icon of God is exclusively directed to each person, right? The center of an infinite sphere is everywhere, a center as unique and privileged, where all points are equally centers, the exclusive privileged point, right? Indeed, the entire sphere is present at each point. Okay. Cusanus was clearly thinking of this parallel, and indeed, he explicitly draws on the connection of the infinite sphere in De Visione Dei by declaring that God's vision is an infinite sphere. Right? Here's what he says. Our eye, our finite human gaze, must turn towards an object because of the quantum angle of our vision, right? So I'm looking here at my computer screen. I have to turn my eye here. If I want to look over there at the chair, I have to move the angle of my vision over there. I have to move my eye up here to see the roof, right? And so on. So I've got to, our eye must turn towards an object because of the quantum angle of our vision. But the angle of your vision, O God, is not quantum, but infinite. It is also a circle, or rather an infinite sphere, because your sight is an eye of sphericity and of infinite perfection. Your sight sees all things simultaneously, around, above, and below, unquote. In this passage, Cusanus also underscores that our vision, like all things pertaining to a finite being, is defined by number, the quantum angle of our vision. We always see from a particular and limited perspective. And if we're looking here, we can't be looking there. If we're focused on this, we can't be focused on that. Right? God's vision, indeed, God's being is not limited in any way to a this or a that, to a here or a there, to a then or a now, by a more or a less. And yet, it is wholly present to this and to that, here and there, then and now, in the least as in the greatest. In their exercises with the all-seeing icon, Cusanus hopes that the monks will experience something like this simultaneous transcendence and immanence of the divine. he emphasizes how impossible it is to imagine while you're looking at the icon that its gaze could be directed in any other direction. It's so fixed on your own gaze, right? Has a monk walk across the room, right? Feels the gaze on him as he moves across the room, even though he knows that the features in the painting itself cannot have moved or changed. The features are fixed, you know, in the dried, unmoving paint of the image, right? Quote, since he knows that the icon is fixed and unchanged, he will marvel at the changing of its unchangeable gaze, right? But, you know, nevertheless, right, if he keeps his eyes on the icon while he moves, he'll be astonished to experience the gaze follow him unwaveringly, you know, different places in the room. And more amazing than that, right, is that all of the other monks are experiencing the same thing. He recommends having two monks walk simultaneously past the painting in opposite directions, and at the same time reporting to each other what they're experiencing, right? He says, when they meet, let them ask the other whether the icon's gaze continuously turns towards him, and he will hear that it moves just the same in the opposite direction. He will believe him, but unless he believed him, he would not imagine this to be possible. And when he is shown this by his brother, he will discover that the face looks unfailingly on all who walk before it, even from opposite directions. Right? And then he goes into a whole thing about this experience of the immovable face that is moved toward the east and west, you know, north and south. It stops when you stop, it moves when you move, right? It's moved to a single place in such a way that it's also simultaneously moved towards all places, et cetera, et cetera. Then he emphasizes the way in which it seems that the gaze deserts no one. He says, this is a quote, it takes diligent care of each, just as if it cared only for the one on whom the gaze is at rest, and for no other, right? It has this, but then we discover it has the same very diligent concern for every creature, for the least as much as for the greatest, and for the whole universe, right? So then in transferring the infinite gaze metaphor to, you know, the infinite as such, God as such, this comes to give a deeper understanding here in this context of divine providence. He also uses it as figurative of creation itself, right, which is produced by the mutuality of gazing, you know, from the being of a creature being seen and seeing, right, constitutes its being. He's got passages where he talks about infinite sight being the measure of all finite visions, and so this that he moves again from the infinite figure of the all-seeing gaze to the idea that the infinite as such, divine unity, is the perfect measure and exemplar of each finite being in general. It's the form of all forms, the most simple and infinite exemplar, truest and adequate exemplar of each particular being, and so on. And of course, that's precisely because of the way opposites coincide in the infinite. Let's see. I want to say a little bit about exploding exegesis. Won't talk. I have to like not talk too long or run out of time. I want to argue that it's not only in sort of like these symbols like the perfect image or the unspoken, hearing the unspoken word, the eating of spiritual food, and so on, that are explosive images. But I want to say that there is also this dynamic of exploding exegesis or exploding interpretation that functions in much the same way as the exploding metaphors that we've already looked at. Meister, Eckhart, and Nicholas of Cusa, indeed, I think, self-consciously engaged in explosive exegesis, like the idea that what you're doing is exploding interpretations in their biblical commentaries and in their sermons. Eckhart, in particular, Donald Duclos, it's a great article, pointed out that Eckhart described biblical interpretation as itself a matter of breaking or breaking through the shell of familiar biblical texts in order to disclose the text's parabolic truths. And he points to Eckhart's German Sermon 51, where this kind of textual shattering and breakthrough is presented as this motion that's simultaneously hermeneutical, speculative, and mystical. Yeah, I have sort of like a whole thing here on German Sermon 51, which I guess I'll skip. But I'll say just a little bit about it. It's a great sermon. It's one in which he's simultaneously giving an interpretation of Exodus 20:12, honor thy father. So he's giving an interpretation of this text. And then he's also doing a meta reflection on interpretation itself. And he goes back and forth between the two throughout the sermon, interweaving both registers, right? And it produces this like active demonstration of the unity of interpretive and spiritual breakthrough. So it's a very cool sermon in this sense. But it also, I think, is one that helps us to see that in the process of kind of breaking the kernel of the text, blasting away the finite interpretation is not just a way of getting at kind of like the kernel or the core or the ground of the text, right? But at the ground of being itself. So it's you know, in the sermon, his language shifts between both registers and implies both registers at the same time, the way he writes it. So, you know, for example, this is where I got the title for the paper. Eckhart says, I have often said the shell must break, zerbrechen, not just brechen, but zerbrechen, shatter, right? And what is within must come out. For if you want to have the kernel, you must break the shell. And therefore, if you want to discover nature uncovered, all likenesses must shatter, and the further you penetrate, the nearer you come to its being. When you discover the one in which all is one, there your soul must stay in this one. So, you know, the interpretive and spiritual breakthrough into the unity of all things and the divine ground kernel follows the same pattern we see before. You know, you begin with the finite likeness, the standard interpretation, the finite interpretation, the surface level interpretation. You shatter all likenesses, interpretations in a way that leads to seeing that this and that is not in separation, but in unity in God. Right? And this itself is an experience of oneness with the divine one. So yeah. Anyway, it's a great sermon. I encourage you to go have a look at it. Yeah, so I was going to give the example of the way in which Eckhart reads the Mary and Martha story. Very briefly, I'll say, you know the story, right? Jesus comes to a village, a woman named Martha receives him into her house. She's got a sister, Mary. Mary sits at the feet of our Lord, listens to his teaching. Right. But Martha was distracted with much serving. She went to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. Right. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things. One thing is needful. Mary has chosen the good portion, which shall not be taken away from her. Okay. So like the standard interpretation here, and even the one that you might expect Eckhart to give, right, is that, you know, Mary is the more spiritually advanced. She's has cut out all distractions. She's not disturbed by this and that and, you know, worldly activity and so on. And she's at the feet of our Lord, really kind of focusing on his words and taking in everything he says, you know, being receptive to the word, you know. And Martha on the main, she's troubled and she's anxious about many things, you know, but like one thing is needful, would, you know, Jesus here, right? And, you know, Mary has chosen the good portion, right? And that shit won't be taken away from her. So you're expecting this kind of reading, and indeed in the tradition, you know, Mary has been taken to be the figure of the contemplative, you know, somebody who embodies the contemplative life, while Martha is a figure for the active life, right? Martha, the active life in motion, outwardly directed, service to the world. Mary, the contemplative life, still, inwardness, directed to contemplation of God, right? Can't be engaged in the active life and the contemplative life at the same time. This is the kind of presupposition that the hearers of the sermon will have. So this is kind of like starting with the finite figure. Contemplation and active engagements are in tension. They're contraries, right? You can't do both at the same time. Contemplation requires withdrawal from the world and activity in general, quieting of the mind, stilling of the body, attention devoted exclusively to the object of contemplation, right? When you contemplate God, you're absent from the world, right? Permanent state of contemplation, not possible in this world, can't sustain it indefinitely in this life. Therefore, you have to divide your life into parts, some of which will be devoted to the active life, some of which to the contemplative life, but the contemplative life is the higher, right? And if you choose that at the right times, in the right way and prioritize that, you're taking the better part. Okay. That's the finite figure. The infinite figure, what? Eckhart explodes the reading. In what sense? Well, it's not just that he says, well, no, it's actually Martha who's the more spiritually advanced of the two. She's the one who is able in all of the busyness and all of the service and all of the activity to nevertheless remain above all of it, in the midst of it, with this kind of still centeredness, right? And Mary hasn't achieved this yet. Martha, when she says, tell her to get up and help me, isn't complaining about, having to do the work alone. She's actually, Eckhart says, she's actually worried about Mary, that Mary is, just kind of like getting kind of like just fulfilled in sort of like the kind of rapturous feelings and pleasure of sitting at the feet of our Lord, right? And so on. But she hasn't understood yet what it is to be living from that still center while still active. She hasn't had that experience yet. She doesn't. She hasn't attained kind of this level of inner spirituality that Martha has, right? And when Jesus says, Martha, Martha, Mary has chosen, the good part or the better part. It can't be taken away from it. Eckhart says, well, it's like he's kind of reassuring Martha, don't worry, Mary will get there, right? She's not there where you are yet, but she will, so don't worry. This you don't have to worry about, right? So what I want to say, it's an explosive reading, not just because he reverses the sort of traditional reading of sort of like who's the more spiritually advanced, right? That's not the most important thing here. What's really important is that he's thinking, in the reading he gives, he's thinking the coincidence of opposites in the figure of Martha now, and in foresight, Mary's going to get there too eventually, right? And what are the opposites? It's the contemplative and the active life, right? Martha is both still and in motion, both contemplative and active, both inward directed and outward directed at the same time. These things that the people to whom Eckhart is preaching think, they don't go together, right? And then when this metaphor is transferred from kind of like the infinite figure, which here I think is Martha, and in foresight, Mary, right? The one who's both still and in motion and so on, right? We see God is both still and in motion, right? Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to have to stop with the textual exegesis, but it sort of goes along those lines. And I'll just conclude by saying again, we've looked at these series of exploding metaphors and interpretations and symbols. I want to emphasize there's a method for engaging in these pyrotechniques. We're not simply aiming to blow up likenesses in order to get them out of the way, in order to, attempt to come to know God. We're using exploding metaphors not just to iconoclastically destroy images or deconstruct likenesses. We engage in exploding metaphorics in order to become likened into God, right? To ourselves become like God, right? when I perform an exploding metaphor, I start with the familiarity of a finite figure, symbol, experience, text, right? I consider its characteristic attributes and relations, right? Determined as they are in this matrix of distinctions, held together and separated by thought governed by the law of non-contradiction. When I conjure the infinite figure, I transfer these characteristics to the corresponding infinite figure, and I watch how the interrelations are radically transformed so that we're able to experience their various functions in a now unified coincidence of what had previously seemed to be necessarily opposing attributes, right? And what is transferred or carried over in this explosion that happens when I conjure the infinite figure is both the experience of the coincidence of opposites, right? And the transformed or deconstructed knowing which experiences this, right? That is, we have here both the radical transformation of the attributes and relations characteristic of the finite figure, and so also this letting go of the process of understanding that's characteristic of distinguishing reason, discursive reason, governed by the law of non-contradiction, right? And this transformed knowing is an unknowing that's at the same time an experiential awareness, an incomprehensible seeing of the coincidence of opposites in divine unity. And when I engage in that kind of unknowing, that kind of awareness, I become godlike, right? This experience then generates the receptiveness for unity with God, precisely because it involves a likening of oneself to God, right? So in Eckhart, this is like then a receptiveness to the birth of the word in the soul and the ultimate breakthrough for Cusanus, right? Receptiveness that takes us right to the gate in the De Visione Dei. Okay, so I want to say that when I see that some contradictions are true, this is not a grasping of one truth among others. That, for example, some contradictions are true while others are not. For Eckhart and Cusanus, this isn't a truth I know, it's a truth I become. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that absolutely inspiring talk. I'll have a lot to think about for the rest of the day now. So let me go ahead and take some questions. Let's start with Zoom. We have one on YouTube, but we'll go there second. Let's start with Ian.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was excellent and excellently presented. I feel like I have a much deeper appreciation of so many images that I thought about before, but I think you really brought home for me in a new way. So I really look forward to reading this. So my question, I think, was going to lead in the direction of the Mary and Martha exegesis, but so maybe I'll be asking you to expand on it a little bit, and it relates a little bit to what I asked Greg last night for me. And you spoke about this experiential transformation that these expressive metaphors facilitate, and I think that what you usually describe that in terms of a transformation of understanding, or transformation of awareness, even a becoming like God, leading to the breakthrough. But I guess I'm wondering about this worldly implications of that. So, like when the word is born and I sort of enter back into the world, and I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about like life without why, how Mary lives this out, and whether this is also a lived transformation. How does this look when I do have to make distinctions? So at like an administrative or policy level, I wonder if you've thought about like kind of taking it in that direction. What would that mean to live without why, to have this insight, and at the same time have to, make decisions and go to faculty meetings and things like that?
Yeah, right. I love that. Go to faculty meetings. Okay. So yeah, I've thought about that a lot. Actually, I had a student. I was on her dissertation committee. I wasn't her advisor, Ellen Fanese, when I was at Boston College, and she wrote her dissertation on love in Meister Eckhart, and I really highly recommend it because I think it speaks in a lot of ways to the question you're asking. So this came up at some point yesterday too. I think I believe it was you were telling Greg, well, it's for Eckhart, it's not always intellect, right? That is the part of the soul, where we can locate, the divine spark or the ground or whatever that is, eternal and is the same ground as God's ground and so on. Sometimes he talks about it as intellect. Sometimes he talks about it as beyond intellect and will, right? And there are these sermons also where he talks about love. And figures in a similar sort of way. So it's almost as though there are these different paths that Eckhart sees depending on which biblical text he's reading and interpreting. And he makes the same moves, but it does, he's not really wedded, it feels like to me, to like having to have a particular structure for how he's talking about it. Right. I mean, it's almost like that, that famous quote where he says, if you're, seeking God by ways, you'll just find the ways and not God. It's like, the candle that's, you're using to try and find God, and you just like think God's the candle or whatever. So there is something that's why I think there's really something about this performative aspect. But what I wanted to say is I bring this love example up because if to the extent that we are living without a why, and in our busy administrative role, as Eckhart was in his life, right, and dealing with people, some of whom are good friends, and others are the most annoying people in the faculty meeting possible, and whatever, right. Eckhart says, we should be loving as God loves without distinction, right? So there's and in that Martha Mary sermon, it's a really complicated, it's a very complex one, and I'm still working through thinking about what he's doing there. But he talks about, it's not as though Christ wasn't moved emotionally and so on some level also, and so will we be. So so that whatever detachment is, it isn't kind of a cold kind of like uncaringness or being kind of like unmoved by what's going on around us, but there's a kind of higher stillness that remains above all of that, and that's in some sense the love that we need to channel to the extent that we can. So I think all of those texts where Eckhart talks about like the relationship between the inner man and the outer man are really important. So in this way we become like God too. There's some kind of, there's the still center that's the source of what flows out, right? In the same way that there's, there's this hinge that remains immobile while the planks of the door are open and close, right? And I think that's a way, that's again another model for thinking about being when Eckhart always says the just man loves justice and is justice, to the extent that you're just, it's this kind of Platonic thing, you're embodying justice. Or you could say the same thing about love, and there's an indistinction about that in the way in which you're, to the extent that you, insofar as you're just, there is no difference between you and divine justice. Insofar as you're loving, there's no difference between you and this indistinct loving. Right. So, I think he gives something like that sort of model. So if you're acting like kind of practically, what does this mean? It's like, to the extent that you are coming from the still center, the way the door moves takes care of itself. Right. But to the extent that you're holding on to possessiveness to the extent that you're holding on to the kind of like, the Eigenschaft, my qualities, right? And then it's me, or like the possessiveness about like, who it is that I love. And these in particular, right? There is no God. And then you're not divine. It's like that passage where I was talking about in the infinite sphere, the person who sees, seeks, and loves what is more or less, right? It's not that they don't find God, it's that they're not divine.
Yeah.
Right. So, I think it's not just to know God, you have to be God in some sense. It's also to, love God, you have to be love. And to love others, you have to be love in from the core of your being in some sense. So I that's how I would try to, I don't know if that's answering the kind of question you're asking.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very, very nice. Thank you.
Sean, please, the floor is yours, and then we'll go to you too.
Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. I echo what Ian said on a number of levels. In fact, you probably can't see all my notes I was writing down while I was listening to you, but my first question I came up with is, can we speak of explosive exegesis? And then you covered that. And then my next question was more about the Mary and Martha sermon and the practical implications thereof. And then Ian sort of stole that one from me. So building on those questions, my new question is, do you think that one of the pragmatic effects of Eckhart's rereading of Mary and Martha can deal more directly with, for lack of a better word, work, even work that takes place in the economic sphere, just like what Ian said? Now, in the background here, I have a couple of things in mind. One is that just a few weeks ago at the PMR conference in Villanova, I and Sam Doubleman, who was part of this conference as well, or at least was joining us on the Zoom call, took part in a session on overcoming the active contemplative distinction in late medieval thought. And we talked a little bit about Eckhart's reading of Mary and Martha there. And Don Duclos was in the audience, and he shared his wisdom about how scripture feeds into that. I think he said something like, you have to realize that when Eckhart interprets scripture in these sermons, I believe he said, vaporizing and inhaling the spiritual sense, which I thought was
I like that. That's very good. Don's great with that.
pretty interesting way of putting it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of in the background. And then the other thing is, I'm not sure if the leading question I'm asking you about work can really be answered conclusively in Eckhart, but maybe that means we just have to look to Tauler and see how someone like Tauler builds on Eckhart and kind of picks up these hints about work and enjoyment becoming one, and then makes it his whole kind of, or an aspect of his whole programmatic approach.
Or Roycebrook maybe also, right? Because Roycebrook has he emphasizes not just kind of like the return. Eckhart wants to just, rest in the one. Right. There's like all this movement of return. Roycebrook, it's, the return and then going back out again. And it's not that that's not there in Eckhart in some places, and that's what I'm emphasizing here. And it's a kind of natural way to read it. Like, what would Eckhart say? Like, why would he read Martha this way? But one of the things that's interesting, I think, about the Mary and Martha sermon is Martha's not quite there in the sermon. She's further along than Mary, but she's at what he calls the rim of eternity. I'm kind of interested in your thing on temporality, actually, your paper coming up. I don't know if it's something you're going to touch on or not, but I'm really interested in. So it's like, I'm not sure what to make of that, but I'll throw it out. I mean, if you're looking at that sermon, I think it's really important to recognize that he says, to a certain extent, even Martha is still living through a certain kind of mediation. So I don't think she's a figure for a kind of, mystical union in some ultimate sense, or a breakthrough for Eckhart. So I'm not sure what to, that's just to say I'm not sure quite what to make of Martha in the sermon. One thing I should say about the way he treats Mary, though, I think is very interesting. Whatever Eckhart thinks about work, and I don't see anywhere where Eckhart really thinks work should be thought of as something that's hindering your oneness with God. Because he seems to think that also, that Mary's in worse shape than Martha. She's sitting there trying to be just like the contemplative, block out the world. Like, it's like the people who Eckhart says they're trying to find God just in the chapel, right? And don't realize, he's in the barn, right? Just as much, right? So that there's like this real misunderstanding of what kind of living out of a divine ground would look like if you think it's like meditation or something, right? So, in that sense, I have to say, when Eckhart says, God's not, you can't find God in this or that, or here or there, or whatever. It feels, you might think, oh, well, that's just all very unworldly then. And in some sense it is, but like all of the things that we do that are supposedly spiritual are also this and that and divided in sort of like these unhelpful ways. So I don't, that's why there's something wrong about thinking that my work can't be the locus of where God is at work in me here and now. I've been reading a lot of Emerson lately, and for those of you who haven't read Emerson, I invite you to, because he's somebody who actually picks up on this idea of my work as my calling, which is distinctly mine, which is at kind of like this point where the center of the infinite sphere and the whole sphere of all of the divine is, and I'm the one who can, in what I do in life, in all of its variety, manifest that in some way, right? That seems very Eckhart, like it seems to me a natural extension of something that's not alien to Eckhart, even though he doesn't develop it, I guess, very much so.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
I think Cusa is a little bit better for giving you tools that you need to think that way.
Okay.
Maybe, I'm not sure.
Maybe I'll ask a question, and then we'll look at the YouTube questions, and then we'll take a break. Yeah, I'd like to ask you about thinking as spiritual exercise. I thought this was an important part of your talk. Not only thinking as spiritual exercise, but maybe also philosophizing in a certain kind of philosophy as a spiritual exercise. So it's not just a secular thing that we do, at least in Eckhartian and Cusanist spirit. And so I was really moved by this idea that when we're thinking about these metaphors, and I really enjoyed how you demonstrated it in the talk, because you, in doing that, you're also taking on the role as teacher. So I also wanted to talk about how the exploding metaphor can play and should play a role in education, in how one would educate and teach what it is to experience the divine in thinking, right? So I think that's really important. And then also that sheds light on our relation to the texts themselves. So when you were leading me through, and I was trying to follow and think through the center is everywhere, circumference is nowhere, then I'm brought to contradiction. The center is the circumference, but how could that be? And then I experienced the explosion. So there is the teaching that helps guide me to, if I'm thinking through the thought experiment, to experience the explosion, the coincidence of opposition. So there's this link between our talks. It's a very clear link here. And this experience of explosion, as you said, also shows the, in a way, ineptitude or the inadequacy of analogy. And you were very, I think, really clearly showed this, that no analogical appeal to proportion is going to work here. So this is a spiritual exercise that we go through, something that we experience in thinking itself. So here was very interesting how the religious life and the life of philosophy meet. And I think that was really demonstrated in the talk itself. And so I wanted to ask you about teaching. Is this a way of teaching? Not only in the text that we write, exploding texts that in themselves explode, and therefore, if they're read this way, show or the the coincidence of opposites, and then teaching in general as a way of leading students rather than to clean it up for them, but to explode it and to show them the truth through the explosion, rather than just leaving them with disaster. So that's one question. My second question is about the practical side, something I didn't talk about yesterday, but there is a sense in which, even in Eckhart, and I think you said it at the end there, that through this unity or likeness with God, you participate in God who is love. And so if you really have undergone this transformation in the love of God and in this unity with God, God's, in a way, omnipresence should entail a kind of transformation of the self, such that in loving God, you love all things. This kind of non-discriminatory love that shines on the good as well as the evil without distinction, right? So when you're talking about the pragmatic consequence, it's one pragmatic consequence for thinking, but also for acting, right? Yeah. Feeding the people at the home. Yeah. That's an act of loving people. Yeah. That ought to be, it seems, a consequence of what that non-discriminatory love, or what that transformation would entail. Anyway, so I think there's a couple questions there. So I'm just curious if you could follow up on those comments, questions.
Sure. Yeah. I'll start with the second one first. And I was just remembering, I don't remember, I think it might be in Councils of Discernment. I don't remember where it is, but somewhere Eckhart says, if you're so busily having sort of an ecstatic rapture of, God's presence or whatever, and you're not like giving soup, right, to somebody who needs it, you're like far from God.
I'm worried about that quite a bit, actually.
Right. So that's exactly his example, right? In reading Eckhart recently, I've really spent a lot of time thinking about language in Eckhart, where it has to do, that the issue has to do, like he's really emphasizing letting go of mindness. So we a lot of times people, when they're talking about Eckhart, they talk about, the sort of self-annihilation aspect, right? Or like, kind of denying of your own will and, all this sort of thing. And when I look at the text, though, for like kind of like mine and yours language, and in German, it's like this eigen, so it's like it's not always translated to get sort of both of them, right? But so there's this connection, but just between distinctness and sort of like what makes you characteristically distinct, this Eigenschaft, and kind of like my stuff, my treasure, me, and so there's also this way in which what I'm trying to overcome is like this fundamental separation that's ultimately an illusion. It's that I'm me and mine, and these people are mine, and this is my stuff, and these are my ideas, and this is, and so kind of the way in which kind of a recognition of the indistinction of all things is a way of overcoming sort of like a profound separation, which then for me translates also into all kinds of has all kinds of political significance, or, how am I in the world? Martin Luther King talked about, the brokenness and sin of separation, or the illusion, or, the illusion of separateness. So that problem of separateness is we could say also kind of a political and social problem. It's a problem in the faculty meeting where things are factionalized and everybody's fighting for their turf, right? So there's that. And then in response to the teaching question, it's funny that you said, so the first thing I thought was, well, yeah, that's exactly what Eckhart does in his sermons, right? Because that's a kind of teaching. So if you read the sermons carefully, you can see him doing it. Like in the Martha Mary sermon, he starts off by saying these 3 characteristics of Martha and these 3 characteristics of Mary. And it looks like he's going to give the traditional interpretation until you see that the 3 characteristics he's just named, he's going to like completely rethink. And then it's like, and he does this kind of, he just like does it gradually. He starts with the finite thing, and then he starts, taking you slowly. And then he just like really complicates stuff in this way so he's taking you on some kind of journey. And I do think that really great teachers do that. And I'll just give an anecdote. So today I'm reading Emerson. That's why I'm thinking about Emerson. And in my class, we just read his essay, Circles. And in Circles, Emerson cites the infinite sphere metaphor. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to practice this. I'm going to try and take my students on I'm practicing this part of my lecture basically on my students, right? Because I just had this idea, maybe I can do that in the lecture. So I practiced it. It was horrible. It went very badly with my class. And it did, because I was trying to tell them where they needed to get without letting them get there. And I realized, after trying to do it, exactly what I had done. Right. So then when I was thinking about how I wanted to do that tonight, I just redid. I did it a very different way than I did it in class. So yeah, I think it has everything to do with teaching and what's effective and what's not.
Yeah, this is something that I've learned from Eckhart in the sermons, and I try to model, not every class, but a lot of my teaching on this, leading students to the explosion experience.
Yeah.
I don't always tell them what to do with it.
Yeah.
Nice. If they ask, then I have something to say, Yeah. So look, I think we're running out of time. There are a couple questions on YouTube, so we should try to, maybe Elizabeth, if you could say something very briefly in response to these. We want to give maybe a 5-minute break before the next talk. So there's a couple of questions. One is, assuming that this mystical image of the infinite sphere is the ultimate formless form, performative, and itself immanent and transcendent to finite form, this seems to be a controlled explosion. So how tightly could it, the B of the 24P, or the sphere itself, be tied to the Euclidean system, to the sublunary non-contradiction logic and mundane machinations of ordinary dynamics?
Wow. Randy, you have to answer this for us. This is, I know Randy. He's great. You want to know anything about the infinite sphere, you got to get in touch with Randy.
Okay.
Let's see, how would it be tied to the Euclidean system? Okay.
And then we have one more.
I don't know that I have anything really brilliant to say about that. I mean, I think, yes, definitely. He's, to the extent that he's, what he's doing is starting with a familiar geometry, like like our familiarity with a finite sphere. We're assuming, standard Euclidean system. And it is surely the case also that in the background, there's kind of like the whole cosmology where we're thinking about, unending motion and circular motion and all this sort of thing. And that's getting somehow exploded here too. What it explodes us into is in another question entirely. But at least as I understand the question, it's got to be pretty tightly tied. Like the vision of the finite sphere that's getting exploded is grounded in like the Euclidean assumptions, like Euclidean standard Euclidean geometry. Yeah.
Okay, and then we have, thanks for your quick answer. And then we have the second question. Should we somehow become one, should we somehow become, one of the last words of your talk, with the sphere? Could the infinite sphere be an ultimate paradigm shift, the paradigm of the sphere, or even Plato's sphere of the paradigm?
Yeah, we should become the sphere. We are already the center, and the whole sphere is already present in our being. And we should become and rest in the sphere that is at our, I mean, the Eckhart, right? That is at our center. And as we were talking about, live out of that. So yeah, I think he thinks, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the talk, and thanks everybody for the discussion. Everyone who raised questions, and yeah. So thanks again for your talk. It was
Thank you.
great. So let's take about a 10-minute break, and I think we'll try to keep to the schedule. We'll come back at 9:45, and we'll hear a talk by Brett Davis, another talk, I believe, yes, on Eckhart and way to Shitsukeru. So I'm looking forward to continue the Eckhart conversation. Thanks a lot, Elizabeth.
Thank
See you.
you.